Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this engaging talk with Akshat Rathi on his new book, which is his first book, Climate Capitalism. It's opening the door for all kinds of new conversations on how economic opportunities are happening right now to kind of drive our energy transition through, thinking about communities, thinking about the people who are fueling these transformations and fostering a better tomorrow. A little bit about New America's Planetary Politics Initiative. So this is a call to action for reimagining a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable global order. Our work is really underpinned on how we need to think out of the box, and our world is becoming hotter, wetter, and more complex. And we need to build and think about new institutions and new solutions that can be better attuned to today's reality. I myself am a senior fellow at Planetary Politics and at New America, and I'm working on the just energy transition questions underpinning everything I just mentioned. I'm also a visiting assistant professor at Pratt Institute's Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment. I teach environmental economics, and I spent the last 15 years helping NGOs, think tanks, and businesses unpack a lot of the climate, environmental justice, resource, and sustainable development challenges of today. Akshat Rathi has a PhD in chemistry from the University of Oxford and a BTech in chemical engineering from the Institute of Chemical Technology in Mumbai. He is an award-winning senior climate reporter for Bloomberg News. He's also the host of Zero, a weekly climate podcast for Bloomberg Green, which you should all check out. And he writes a weekly newsletter on climate solutions. We're chatting today at a unique moment where the UN General Assembly is going to be happening this month in conjunction with Climate Week, and there are going to be a lot of questions around the future of the Sustainable Development Goals. Only 17% of the goals will be achieved by 2030. 0% of the climate goals will be achieved, but a good sizable amount of the energy access goals will be achieved. We're also having this conversation in advance of COP29 in Baku, where a lot of the kind of technical finessing is going to happen that will pave a better path forward for the next round of NDCs at COP30. And the US elections are underway. So as usual, unprecedented times, a lot of things happening all at once. But just to kind of recap a little bit about Climate Capitalism, the book demonstrates really how it is possible to harness the forces of capitalism, which is the system that we operate in financially, to tackle our climate challenges and foster new solutions. Akshat Rathi's books weaves together the stories of change makers and the technologies and resources that they've developed and pushed forward into the mainstream. A lot of things like EV batteries were considered backwater technologies in the 90s and very expensive, and now they are affordable for everybody and not just those with most. Within his book, the kind of framing is all about where technology, people, and policy kind of come together to create this path forward. And he weaves together very artfully these stories of the actual people making this change, while also unpacking a lot of the technology and the science behind it all in a way that's readable and digestible. And if you have not read anything about anything to do with our climate and energy transformation, this is definitely a good one to pick up. But from Denmark's Ørsted, transforming from a petro company to a wind energy powerhouse, to Wang Gang's role in transforming EV and battery technologies in China and beyond. This book tells the story of our present messy middle, which is where we're at, as well as giving us a window into a potential renewable future. Akshat, I'd love you to just share a little bit about why this book, what inspired you to write it. And please correct me if anything I said was what you want to add to.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Martha. That was a lovely introduction, both to me and the book. Very generous. And thank you to New America for hosting the conversation. Thank you for all those listening. Books can be many things. For me, books are conversation starters. They are things where I learn, but then I am left with many questions and I want to find more answers. And I hope this book is one of those, which is you come in, you have questions, and I hope you still have questions at the end of reading it, because this challenge is not one that we're going to solve anytime soon. And that is the nature of the scale of the challenge. And no one has the perfect answer. No person, no company, no country. And even if you have a set of solutions, those set of solutions will change as we get deeper into the transition. So very much, a place to have conversations. And what is a conversation if it's not a little bit provocative? And so the title itself, climate capitalism, everybody has feelings about capitalism, even as everybody loves capital, right? Money in the bank is good, but capitalism, I don't know. So if you are skeptical about capitalism's role in tackling climate change, this is the book for you. And if you're convinced that capitalism is the way to go, this book is still for you, because the way capitalism is run right now is not going to get us there. But there are places where we are seeing tweaks and changes and modifications, enhancements that are allowing for these solutions to work. So the core of the book, I wanted to try and get to solutions, but not just solutions because there are so many now, and that's a good thing, but solutions that are working at scale. And what are the ingredients that went into making those solutions work at scale? That was the central question I wanted to answer. And I ended up with that title. No, I did not start with it, because what I found was all the solutions that are working at scale happen to work in a capitalist system. As much as we know the system has flaws, and as much as the call from activists is that there is no way to tackle this problem without overthrowing capitalism altogether, well, until we get there, we can't wait, and we need to get on with these solutions. And there are ways in which we can do it. And so the title is very much a conclusion of the book, not the starting point.
No, love that. And at the end of the day, our climate crisis is an energy problem. Although often we focus on the outcomes of climate and not necessarily the cause when we're talking about the climate problem. And it's worth just mentioning, before any kind of climate agreements, before Paris, we were on a path for 4 degrees Celsius of average warming. And while it's imperfect, we're now on a path to around between 2 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. We could get that even further down. We'll likely have an overshoot on 1.5. But as you go through in your book, the path to net zero is in motion. Like, it's happening right now, whether or not it's being fully realized by everybody. But is it enough to get to net zero by 2050?
I think from a science perspective, that's what scientists have said, right? There is a way in which we can talk about climate goals and climate action, which to me is very much about ensuring that we have a planet on which people can thrive, not just survive, that people of all backgrounds are able to access opportunities that a good human life presents. And that has been the story of progress for humanity, well, forever, but especially over the past 200 years with the Industrial Revolution. But we are now starting to see the downsides of that relentless use of fossil fuels that has given us progress. And it is starting to take those opportunities away from people. We are seeing a rising hunger. We are seeing obviously rising impact on climate impacts of all kinds around the world. But we are also seeing rising poverty. And just today there was a study looking at how Africa is now losing between 2% and 5% of its gross domestic product annually right now, right? A continent that's done the least and has the most room to grow, has the most justification to grow economically and help its people. So that to me is the sort of way in which we should talk about climate. And I feel like finally in some places politicians are starting to make those connections. But then there's the science side of it, and it's absolutely crucial because as much as the aspiration is uh, completely one that should inspire people, should make people want to work on climate solutions, we also need to figure out what are the targets and how do we get there. And what science tells us is that get to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050,
Mhm.
and you could get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this is an analysis from 2018 when the IPCC 1.5C report had come out. We've not been on track on reducing emissions to net zero. So there are already we are sort of behind. So perhaps if you do an analysis now, you look at a net zero CO2 emissions earlier than 2050, perhaps 2045, but it's about that range. Now, a couple of things to note from the science side, it is net zero CO2 emissions. The problem is not just CO2, it's all greenhouse gas emissions. So in fact, we do have some leeway. We might be able to reduce some other greenhouse gas emissions like methane emissions faster. Maybe we find an agricultural solution which addresses nitrogen emissions faster. That might give us a little more room and still keep to a net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. So there is some room to play, but that room or that carbon budget, as the scientists talk about, the total amount we can put into the atmosphere, that is limited and it's shrinking.
Yeah. Love that you mentioned methane. It's far more heat trapping than CO2. And we don't yet have like the same kind of global targets on it. Um,
Well, we do, but they're not, quite
yeah.
quite the same, right? Not all countries have signed up to it, but yes, the reduction of 30% of methane emissions by 2030 is a target by most major emitters now.
Yeah. Do you foresee the upcoming conferences of the parties in Baku and in Brazil as helping us get closer to that path?
Well, that again is sort of one of those things about the global climate fight. It's been going on for decades. Never taken seriously, clearly, given where we are. But not to say it hasn't made progress all through those years. So the COP process is one facet of the climate fight, and it's a very important facet because it's the one place where all countries come together and have, over the years now, clear mechanisms with which they have to report, they have to be held to account for the targets that each on their voluntary basis must reach. Um, and it's a place where the mechanisms of how to make those solutions work between rich countries that have emitted the most amount of greenhouse gas emissions versus developing countries who want more room to develop. And right now, that seems to be a carbon heavy development, even with the rise of renewables. There's always that tension that needs to be resolved of what rich countries can do to make that process easier and ideally least carbon intensive. And so in that vein, we have, especially since the Paris Agreement in 2015, every COP we've seen progress. Certain COPs you see more progress, other COPs are more procedural, but ever since Paris, I think every COP is a significant COP. And so COP29 in Azerbaijan is a significant COP. That just has to be the case. The main thing that people will be arguing over at COP29 is, and we'll get into jargon very quickly, but it's called NCQG, and it's basically a goal that is a big money number, which developed countries are to be giving to developing countries to make sure this transition happens faster, because they are not the ones who are responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that sit in the atmosphere. And until now, that number was $100 billion annually, and they were, rich countries were supposed to reach that number by 2020. They only reached it in 2022. But now the number has to grow, and has to grow a lot. And so that is going to be a fight. It's in rich countries right now, interest rates are high, aid budgets are being stretched both by wars, but also climate impacts. And so we're going in for a tense period. It's going to be, Baku is going to start negotiations on climate stuff a week after the US election. So the outcome of the US election will shape the conversations a lot. But But that's only the headline. There are lots of other small things that need to be sorted out at every COP. And we can talk about some of those as well.
Yeah. I was personally kind of excited when I saw, out of SV60 and other jargon, just like the pre-technical meetings before the COP, mention of tech transfers. And it's like, oh, we're doing that or we might do that in a big way, other than just a voluntary way. So yeah, I think it'll be an interesting COP to watch, even though it's maybe, kind of under the radar compared to COP30 in Brazil. People have been talking about COP30 in Brazil for the last 2 years. But it's clear we're going to have probably an overshoot, and we could, get back down to 1.5 later. But how can CCS and direct air capture help us on this path, while reducing reliance on fossils rather than a path or an excuse to drill more?
Yeah. I think one way to think about climate solutions, and this is just whether you're an expert, you know this stuff, or whether you're new to it, is good to have some shorthands. A very good shorthand is that we should try and electrify as much of our lives, industry, agriculture, transport as possible, because we know how to decarbonize electricity, and we are decarbonizing electricity very quickly. So in your energy consumption pie, which is about 80% of the problem of greenhouse gas emissions, that is the quickest thing you can do. But the reason we talk about CCS, which is carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture, which is removing carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere and putting that underground or in some form where it doesn't enter the atmosphere, is because as much as electrify everything and decarbonizing electricity takes us a long way, it doesn't take us to zero emissions. And there's something just hard about climate science. Zero is a very clear place to get to. And it gets harder the closer you get to zero emissions. And so carbon capture and storage is the technology where you capture emissions from a point source, such as a smokestack of an industrial facility or even a power plant, as a few places do already, and then store that deep underground in places where oil and gas is found typically. It's a technology that's been around for 50 years. It's not been a technology around for 50 years as a climate solution. If anything, CCS has been used by the oil and gas industry to extract more oil. It's sort of, carbon dioxide is a really interesting molecule, and you can compress it, make it a liquid, put it in an oil field that is depleting, and get more oil out like you would, with soap. And so they've done that, and we know it can work. The thing that hasn't happened is, how do you make it a business model where you don't extract oil with that CO2, but you still put the CO2 underground? That costs money, and that money has to be paid for. In places like Europe, where I live in London, there is a carbon price, and you could essentially have a business model around carbon capture and storage where the company gets paid for cleaning up our atmosphere or not dirtying it. In places like the US, there isn't a carbon price nationally. And so the way the US is doing is through tax credits. But it's good to separate these technologies out. Point source carbon capture is a mature technology that can work. We know it does work, but it needs a business model. It needs the oil and gas companies to actually go forth and deploy these climate solutions. And that's just been hard because of the business models that they operate, which is about extracting carbon. Direct air capture and carbon removal industry in general has been a newer set of technologies. So direct air capture is one type of technology, but there are several carbon removal technology. There are, in fact, 800 carbon removal startups as a recent count. And a lot of the startups have not come from the oil and gas background. And that's been somewhat of a blessing, because they're not encumbered with a business model about extracting carbon. Their entire business model is around removing carbon. And so that's allowed some companies, especially supported by tech companies that are, large, have money, want to meet their climate goals, buying very expensive carbon removal technologies, and it's led to a certain amount of startups getting a runway. But they are also getting to a point where they will struggle because there are now 800 carbon removal startups and not enough companies buying carbon removal because most of that business has been voluntary. So until you have regulations, until you have a business model, climate capitalism, you're not going to get either of these technologies scaling up as we need.
Yeah. And, in some ways, these tools could be employed in, heavy emitting sectors like steel production and cement production, where it's like, well, we need these things, but also, they create a lot of emissions, and this could be a way to kind of ameliorate that.
Yeah, so carbon capture and storage, point source carbon capture and storage as a climate solution has a history. And it has been, as you said, mostly been used as a climate solution on industrial emissions, on oil and gas refining, etc. There have been a couple of coal power plants that have used carbon capture and storage, but given electricity can be decarbonized with just cleaner sources like sun and wind and geothermal or even nuclear, the better place to put carbon capture now is on places where the alternative is much, much more expensive or doesn't exist. So cement is a very good example where just the process, even if you clean up the fossil fuels, cement, the process goes from calcium carbonate to calcium oxide, releases CO2, and you do need to capture that CO2. So carbon capture is a very good solution. In some cases, even things like steel plants, which, if they've been built in the last 10 years, have a life that will let them go for another half a decade if we let them, and they all use coal right now. For them, the solution might be to deploy carbon capture. So there are very clear places where it can go, and it would be good to see some of those places start to get carbon capture.
Yeah. In your book, you do build the economic case for, a just energy transition, not just the energy transition. But you do mention, rightly so, how some of the big shocks that have happened in the last, I guess, 50 years since the 70s have fostered some really serious innovation, around the oil shock in the 1970s and more recently with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And often these innovations are like efficiency or alternatives driven. But what are some under the radar innovations or actions that could yield big results?
So, there are many ways to think about how innovation in the energy space plays out. You talked about efficiency and alternatives. The driving force behind them, you could say, is money, right? If you are more efficient, which is you do the same thing with fewer resources, you save money. You get the same productivity for lower emissions in this case. Or in the case of alternatives, right, in the 1970s, a whole slew of American oil companies got into what was then known as alternative energies. They invested in solar and nuclear and battery research. That's how we actually got the lithium-ion battery. It was invented in an ExxonMobil lab. And those were alternatives because money said, we want energy. There was no energy to be gotten from oil because that was coming from the Middle East that had embargoed the oil. And so what can we put that money to find in different forms of energy? But I would say another motivation for all of this could be better seen as comfort or convenience. And the energy transition, as much as it's been economic, it's actually been more driven by convenience. So electricity world over in most places is still more expensive than, say, gas. But you don't want a gas operated laptop, even as it might be cheaper to use that energy. You want an electricity driven laptop. You want an electricity driven fridge. And that's because it's just more convenient as a form of energy coming into your house, even if it's a little more expensive. And so a lot of the energy transition has been about being driven through convenience. And so innovation in that form has come toward convenience. It's only in the last 2 decades or so we've been focused on innovation for carbon emissions. So far it's been money, economics, or convenience. Now we add the carbon layer. And it's good to have that focus given we need to meet their climate goals. But let us not forget that if we can find carbon producing innovations, but that are also more convenient, then or more comfortable, they will have more of a runway. And that's why we are seeing how much electric cars are going further because they are more convenient. Yes, you need to charge once in a while, but you can charge at home. You don't have to go to a fossil fuel station. Same thing with heat pumps. Especially here in Europe, you do need heating during the winters. And heat pumps are just so much more convenient because they can not just heat and be very efficient in heating, but they can also cool because summers here are getting quite hot. And so you can get an air conditioning solution alongside your heating solution. And so there are ways in which you can combine these three factors, cost, convenience, and carbon, and you get a set of innovations that allow you to do more than you would otherwise.
Yeah, heat pumps have maybe the worst marketing name, and are a great solution. A lot of like this is one of those things that are involved in a lot of the New York City specific kind of innovations for home upgrades. It's like helping folks pay for heat pumps, and they were doing it before the IRA.
Well, technically, refrigerator is a terrible term too. It's a very bad phrase. Fridge is fine. Maybe it gets a little bit better, but it's still like it's an awkward word. Like fridge, ugh,
We need,
frightening. I don't know.
we need someone to come in
So
and
it's
support it.
so I don't think as much as marketing is important in getting these solutions, I don't think marketing is going to be the only reason, right? Like if anything, a refrigerator is a heat pump. It's just a one direction heat pump. It's taking heat, from the inside of the refrigerator, throwing it out. Um, but yes, it would be good to have some fun names for the heat pump. That should be a contest that somebody should run.
Yeah. Um, next combo, we'll invite a marketing firm.
Well, while we are at it, we should also try and rename the refrigerator.
Yeah. It's been around for so long. I have never really thought of it as not being like a clear cut term. It's like, of course, it's a refrigerator. Like that's just what it
Of
is.
course it is,
That's what it
because
is.
it's so convenient to have some cool water and some ice cream in the house.
Yeah. I guess you could have called it an ice box. Go real way back. Um, from avoiding negative externalities to like from our climate, just fueling our climate reality, that nobody asked for, frankly, to jobs creation. In what ways is the renewable or this third energy transformation already benefiting the global economy?
Well, that's a very good question. It's, I said how Africa's gross domestic product is being affected by climate in a negative way. 2 to 5% is huge on an annual basis, right? The US economy for the last 30 years has been growing at 2%. So, cutting that off for a very small economy is it's really bad. But then there's the flip side of the renewable transformation and just the energy transition in general. One thing that will happen is as energy becomes cheaper because of renewables, you'll be able to get more work through for every dollar of energy you purchase, so to speak. And that will have an impact on your economy. The second thing that will happen is because electrification in almost all cases, or at least most of the cases, is a more efficient use of energy, right? Your electric car goes 4 times the distance for the same amount of energy than a gasoline engine does. The same is true of a heat pump, does 4 times the heating as a gas boiler would do. You start to get, again, a gain in economic output for lower use of energy. And the third thing that happens is we know fossil fuels are what they are because they are only found in certain places, and it is being used by countries, most recently by Russia, as a weapon to try and control other economies. And with clean energy, you can get energy within your own boundaries. In most cases, it may not be true for island states or small states, but for most other countries, there is enough land and water resources available to be able to extract renewable energy. And that allows for energy independence, which is a politically salient selling point everywhere, not just in America. And that allows for, again, with access to clean, cheap energy that is reliable, that is domestic, you get a boost in growing and developing your economies.
Yeah, absolutely. The our extractive present and past has benefited a couple dozen countries that are oil producers or coal producers. If we go back enough in time, wood producers. And a renewable future could mean one that is benefiting everybody. Even, but we'll have to go through this messy transition first.
Yes and no. I think in a way, places which had access to clean energy have shown what they can do. So Iceland is a very good example. It was a developing countries in the 60s, and because it got access to geothermal energy, not that it did not have access, it was sitting on volcanoes all that time. It just found a way to tap into it and turn it into usable energy, and suddenly go to Iceland. And it is one of the richest places to be, a very well-functioning, high-functioning democracy that runs on geothermal power. But also, it's not just renewables, right? You need both renewables, but also electrification. An example of that is, look at India. India's rail network, which is among the largest in the world, third or fourth in the ranks, um, is 93% electric. And why is that? Because the alternative would be diesel. India doesn't have very much oil. And why would you do that? You would use electric uh, engines, electric motors to drive your trains. America, less than 1% electrified in its railways. So you get a petrostate like in America, and you get railways that are not powered by electricity. So already the transition, because of economic forces, has been, you can see in places where it's already benefiting those countries. What we now need to do is do it everywhere, all at the same
Yeah,
time.
yeah, for sure. And this kind of leads nicely into my next question. Energy companies want to be in the business of making energy. Um, though the energy of the future will be different than the energy we're using right now. And the energy we're using right now is different than the energy we were using in the the century before last. Even though I still think back and I'm like, yeah, it's 1990s were yesterday. It's like, no. Um, you dive into that transformation in a couple ways in your book, sharing the story of Orsted, but also of Occidental Petroleum, and what can we learn from technological change and kind of these political and market forces that drove that kind of transformation in both those cases.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is companies that do not see a technology coming, they die. And we have those examples in recent history. Nokia, BlackBerry, things that we, at least us in our 30s probably know of, things that, we've held in our hands. Kodak, the film photograph, it's gone. And so technologies that are not useful, not convenient, not cheap, um, will go away. So either oil and gas companies find a way to figure out what the future of energy, what their role in the future of energy is, or they die. And that's capitalism for you. It's a healthy way. It's a creative destruction that you would welcome in a well-functioning economy. When it comes to the people, though, that transition is one where states have to be responsible. So if companies are making poor decisions about the future of their companies, then there will be job losses. And if petrostates like America or Saudi Arabia or Russia, which will see a decline in their fossil fuel consumption at some point, and in some cases are already seeing it, right? Saudi Arabia is now pumping, I don't know, 20% less than 25% less than it used to pump when oil prices were very high and there was not enough oil being pumped in the rest of the world. But it's right now holding and sitting on that capacity and does not get as much oil rents as it possibly can. And so uh, what Occidental Petroleum is doing and why it's in the book is a good way of thinking about what an oil company that does not want to give up on its core competency of moving large volumes of oil and gas or large volumes of fluids around can do in the 21st century. Uh, in this case, Occidental Petroleum wants to become a carbon removal, a carbon management company. So rather than extracting the carbon from the ground, put it back into the ground. And they are building a large-scale plant, the world's largest direct air capture plant, and it's under construction right now, should be in operation by end of 2025, 26. And we'll see if that bet is one that they can scale. First plant is a good one to have. We know that they're getting all these purchase orders from large companies for those carbon removal tons that they will have, 500,000 ton every year. But that's the bet they are making. They're saying, we don't know if we can do clean energy and renewables because we've never done them, but we know how to move large amounts of fluids, and this is what we can do. Ørsted is a different example, whereas it used to be called Danish Oil and Natural Gas Company. And today it's widely known as the world's largest offshore wind company. In fact, Martha, you pointed out that Ørsted, does have some coal assets even now, but it's shutting them down. And so the way that story played out is quite different. It was a much longer decadal experimental thing that Danish government was doing with its state-owned oil company. And basically it used it as an instrument to serve the needs of the state as it needed. In the 70s, when it was created, it needed more oil. In the 80s and 90s, it needed more gas. So it did all that. In late 90s and early 2000s, it needed to become an energy company, not just doing oil and gas, but also power. And so it got coal assets. But in the process, it also did experiments like building offshore wind turbines. And when Denmark signed up to host Copenhagen COP in 2009, the Danish government also passed a climate law. It also had a carbon price that was starting to ramp up. And for Ørsted, the business model was just much better to move away from fossil fuels. And the one bet it could make was offshore wind, and that's what it doubled down on. So it is more an accidental story than it is a corporate case study, as most business schools make it. But you can learn from it, which is either you make a technology bet and you as a company go for it, or you work with the state to figure out what kind of business model would serve the state the best or serve your customer. In this case, for Danish Oil and Natural Gas Company, the state was its largest consumer of energy, and then find a business model that will work to serve your customers.
Yeah, I mean, that arc of time that, of, the Danish company Ørsted, we don't have that privilege of time. And you definitely touched on some of the kind of nuggets we should be thinking about honing in on. What else can we kind of learn from Ørsted to apply today? Like in terms of the need to make an expedient transition.
Yeah.
Have that time.
So what is true is that after it decided it'll move away from fossil fuels, it actually set a target that was much further out. So by the end of 2030, it wanted 80% of its business to be clean energy, 20% to be fossil fuels. Well, as you know, by 2025, it'll be fully renewables. And so what happened? Well, a couple of things. One is that doing something new looks hard at first, but when you start doing it, you find ways to do it better and perhaps more quickly. That's been true for, even at a macro scale for solar. People thought solar is going to be very expensive for a very long time, but no, it became cheaper because of a number of support from states like the US and then Germany and Spain and then China, but also entrepreneurial spirit of learning by doing. Getting the engineers to work on the small problem and how to make it more efficient and cheaper. And so Ørsted was able to do that. The other thing Ørsted did, which is a lesson that is very useful, is to use your own people who know your company and who have the skills, but transition them into jobs that might be relevant in the new world. So Ørsted had a bunch of offshore oil and gas executives, engineers, managers who all could use their expertise and apply it to an offshore wind development. And so a lot of the jobs were transitioned into clean energy through retraining programs, but also sometimes they didn't even need that. And so there are places where maybe it doesn't happen within the same company, but places where governments can help transition workers to new jobs. Geothermal, for example, is a very good place right now because it's getting into using oil and gas technology like fracking to produce clean energy. And a lot of oil and gas engineers, I spoke to a company called Fervo, which is based in the US. They're using the expertise in the oil and gas industry. They're based in Houston. They hire oil and gas engineers to do clean energy. And there are more and more of those opportunities that are coming.
Yeah. These large scale, kind of micro economic changes that are happening on a company level are so important. But how can we ensure that this net zero future embeds equity and accessibility?
This is one of those opportunities. We can think of it as a problem because we usually don't think of equity at the start of a problem. We think about it after we've deployed it and realized, oh dear, this has not been an equitable solution. But the climate challenge from the start is a problem of inequity, right? The greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere are unequally having been put there in the last 200 years. And the burden and the responsibility is also unequal, and the impact is also unequal. The poorest will suffer the most. And so when addressing climate change, there is just no way that equity cannot be thought of in any type of solution that you want to deploy. And that's a good thing. It's in your face, it's being forced to you. These COP meetings that happen every year are a fantastic reminder that this is an equity issue from the start. Now, having recognized that and having that constant reminder should ideally force you also to recognize that many of the solutions that we are going to deploy will be resource intensive. Yes, we're going to reduce mining by 99.95%, but we will increase metals mining, right? We will reduce fossil fuel mining, which is most of the mining we don't do, but we will have to increase the amount of metals that we are mining. And if we use the same colonial extractive mindset and trample over rights, then we are not going to get as much metals as we want at the cost that we want from the places that we want them. And if we can keep equity in mind, we'll be able to do that right, but also in that process, bring along people to support climate solutions rather than make it a culture war issue or make it a north-south divide issue. We are, again, this is theoretically that should happen. We're starting to see some places where it is happening. So the EU, for example, wants access to metals that will go into batteries. It is now working in South America with countries like Chile, where it wants access to the lithium, but in return, it's saying we're not just going to come and take all your lithium. We will also bring in technologies like building electric buses, that we'll build factories in Chile and allow for some technology transfer, some jobs to be created as a result of the benefit that we will have from your mines. So those kinds of solutions can be really powerful. We're also looking at, through this COP system, things like the Just Energy Transition Partnership, where G7 countries are coming and giving money to countries like South Africa and Indonesia to help them move away from coal to cleaner energy. In that process, they're going to have, Danish companies are going to come and deploy many of those solutions in South Africa. So there is a two-way route here, but South Africa benefits too because it gets access to clean energy and it loses all the air pollution and the mining-related injuries that come from coal.
Yeah, there's that link between extractivism and authoritarianism and colonialism, and we really have like it's a lot to unpack, and it's a lot to really just own up to in regards to like how we transition, right? Because of course we could just do whatever. Anything's possible, but how we transition matters, right? Um, a big role in this transition is trade, right? Trade and tariffs. Recent EU and US trade restrictions on Chinese EV components, as well as renewable energy products, and other metals and the like, has been kind of a big part of a lot of conversations. And while these actions could increase the cost of transition for the US and the EU, how will this impact other countries?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the EU and the US first, and then look at other countries. But you could game this out and be like, well, if those solar panels, cheap solar panels from China are not going to the US, they will find a market somewhere else in the world where there are no tariffs, and that is happening. There is now more than a terawatt of solar production capacity. And just to, make sense of what a terawatt is, until 2021, all the solar that was ever deployed anywhere in the world added up to 1 terawatt. Now we have an annual capacity to produce that much solar. And so it'll find a home, and it'll find a home, and other countries might benefit from cheap Chinese solar. But from a US and EU perspective, tariffs are a blunt instrument, and but they're also a powerful instrument if wielded well. And from all the experts I've spoken to, the use of tariffs on solar seems to be a very bad idea, because no solar business, Jenny Chase is a fantastic solar analyst with Bloomberg NEF, says no solar business has ever made money. And so doing solar is just a bad, horrible business to get into. Why don't you let the Chinese do it? And given the capacity for solar is already there, much better to not try and bring those manufacturing jobs back to the US or EU. That's not true of things like batteries or electric vehicles, or even mining jobs, right? Rare earth metal mining jobs. Like there are plenty of jobs that could be created in Europe and the US, which would be slightly more expensive. They won't be as expensive. The difference wasn't be as much as solar or as much as solar, but that difference will be there. Those will be slightly more expensive, but they will bring jobs that will have viable, sustainable business models to support them in the US and the EU. And much better to focus your tariffs on things that you think can actually create sustainable business models. In the case of solar, that's not happening.
Yeah, for sure. And we still have the energy accessibility problem, right? The IEA estimates that there are still 774 million people without energy access. These are people who don't have a light switch to turn on, and that means all kinds of different human development challenges, because energy is also a development challenge. Technology and knowledge transfers for medium and developing economies could help close that gap. What are some successful examples or notable gaps to renewable energy technology transfers that might be happening right now that maybe aren't top headline news?
Yeah. So $779 million, 774 million people is a big number, but it's also a conservative number in a way. It's about, as you said, people who don't have access to being able to turn the lights on inside their homes because they don't have electricity. But it's also conservative because it is not enough just to give somebody light. You want to be giving them access to energy at a much higher amounts. And so there's a group called Energy for Growth, which is come up with a figure that is 1,000 kilowatt hours per person is what needs to be given for development. And if you put that number, then energy poverty is a much bigger figure. It's billions of people who still don't have access to that much energy. But there are really good stories coming out of the transition that can really accelerate reduction in energy poverty. Many which we've touched upon, the fact that you can place renewables wherever. We are getting a real growth in microgrids, these solutions where solar and batteries can be put in a village and they are not connected to a big grid. But eventually, when there's enough economic case for a grid to reach, they can be connected in, and a microgrid becomes part of the large grid. And there's a huge rise in microgrid solutions. We're also seeing very interesting examples of countries where they are energy poor because they just don't have access to fossil fuels. They're choosing to go electric, right? Sort of the leapfrog that we hope would happen. We're starting to see that in some places. So Ethiopia has banned fossil fuel car imports because it just doesn't have its own fossil fuels and its oil import bill is very high. But if you want to import electric cars, which it is doing with China through free trade, and the Chinese EVs are pretty cheap, you're welcome, and you can use those, and you can get those from wherever you want. And so you're starting to see this kind of leapfrog happening in some places where, and with electric cars, you get 4 times the distance for the same amount of energy. So it is also an energy challenge that is being solved alongside being a decarbonized solution. So we are starting to see those examples. Electric two-wheelers, for example, are a huge seller now. India, every time I go back home, I just see them everywhere, and they're now such a common sight. I sometimes have to be until they turn it on. I'm not sure whether it's an electric or a fossil fuel two-wheeler. So yeah, it's nice to see that.
Yeah. Transformation's already happening in these small examples, but they have big impacts, right? Because it means people in those communities aren't breathing in as many emissions, and then they have better health outcomes because they're not breathing in those emissions. We have a lot of climate unprecedented times. It would be remiss for me to not mention how, what are we on, like month 15 of, above 1.5, thanks to this El Nino push. And climate impacts, but also climate opportunities are all around us. One could argue that the U.S. presidential election underway is kind of a referendum for the U.S. In terms of how we choose to meet this climate challenge. Whether or not we want to be a part of the solution or potentially a roadblock. What are some climate challenges and opportunities that would face the next U.S. president?
Yeah. Well, even before we get to who the next US president would be, which is, I don't get into the job of predictions, but it's worth recognizing that climate as a challenge is not being really talked about in either side of the aisle, even though it's clear the Democrats have something to offer while the Republicans really don't. Neither of them are talking about it in any grand way right now. And so the question you posed, which is it's sort of a referendum on whether the US wants to be a part of the global climate solution, is true, it is, except nobody in the electorate knows that. And this is the part of climate which is, at an intellectual level, once you understand the problem, you realize a global problem needs global solutions. But then you need to take the next step. And the next step is that this global challenge, which requires global solutions, will happen locally. And again, just going right to the start of the conversation, as long as we aren't able to communicate the benefits that come from tackling climate change through climate solutions to the people who are voting for this referendum, you're not going to get the right choice being made. That's just simple math. And so, even before you get to whether what are the challenges that the US president faces, the biggest challenge is that they don't have an informed electorate. making a choice that would allow them to be able to deal with this global challenge. So now, the scenarios faced with either of the president will be kind of the same. The planet is warming. There'll be more global climate impacts. Uh, you know, there will be insurance companies running away from providing insurance, and your debt bills are going to go up, and you're going to have to build industries that you have not in the past. All those things will happen regardless of whether it's a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency. Uh, but the solutions they are likely to deploy are going to be very different. And we do know that, at least in terms of what is presented, the Harris administration at least has some opportunity to start to address that in a longer term fashion, whereas a lot of the analysis around, Project 2025 and the types of um, goals that they have, which is putting blanket tariffs on all things, on increasing fossil fuel production because that's easy, cheap energy that's domestic, is going to lead to short-term gain for very big long-term harms. And I hope the electorate over the next 2 months is informed that if this is a referendum, there is a very clear choice here, and that choice, is not going to be something you and I can talk about enough to make clear to the electorate. It really has to come from the leaders running in the election.
Yeah. Yeah, there's often a misunderstanding of oil markets, and you just talk to folks
Yeah.
and it's it doesn't matter if we drill it here, it has to go to a refinery. Most oil ends up in refineries globally. It's globally traded, so it's not
Yeah, and you pump
filters
more
and
and
reused here,
Saudi Arabia pumps less, the price remains the same.
Yeah. Balance. A policy-led approach really relies on a mix of incentives, subsidies, and other means of support, public-private partnerships, or even just big signals, like these moments that happen at different conferences of the parties. You dive into China's approach to EVs and renewables, and the UK's approach to reducing overall emissions in your book. What do you see as the most replicable or salient approaches that can be applied to medium and developing economies?
Yeah, well, because of this nature of a global problem that needs local solutions, we just have to recognize that there are different types of policies that can be applied in different types of politics. UK is fortunately still a robust democracy, and a robust democracy requires you to have people who, vote on elected leaders and elected leaders who bring in laws. The UK supported a climate change act back in 2008 unanimously, almost unanimously. There were 3 or 4 votes in the parliament that voted against it. But that climate change act has been substantially responsible for the UK still being a leader in cutting global greenhouse gas emissions. UK's emissions are 50% of what they were in 1990. Is among large economies is the fastest in cutting greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of it came from moving from coal to gas, but also because of this Climate Change Act, which set out very clear targets and created accountability on governments, regardless of their politics, to stick to these goals. China is a very different politics. It's a dictatorial politics. It's state-driven capitalism. It's a different kind of economic system too. And the goals and the way in which you can get climate policy there is very different. And so the Chinese one is driven very much in a jingoistic way. They're not going after reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They're going after things that will solve problems they face. Air pollution. How can we get EVs on the ground so that we can cut air pollution and not have smoggy Beijing, which has become a reality now. 10 years ago, go to Beijing and you would feel like you're in Delhi, which is the case today, right? The Delhi is the small capital of the world today. And so EVs were a solution to solve the air pollution problem, but also to solve an oil import problem, because then you could power it with electricity. Yes, that electricity might come from coal, but it's coming from your domestic sources, and that solves another problem. And then the third thing it does is it gives you an edge on an export industry. That's why you're seeing Chinese EVs, in most parts of the world, even with places like Europe where there are now tariffs, you see Chinese EVs. Vans that we get for deliveries are now Chinese EVs. And it's solving for all these problems, not really for carbon, even as it has a climate target, even as it has promised that it'll peak emissions, it's solving for these problems first and then the carbon problem. So you do get different forms of climate capitalism, one that would be fit for the politics that you have in your country. And that's why at the start said there isn't a perfect one, but there are blueprints. The UK's Climate Change Act has become a blueprint for other climate change acts in France and Sweden, New Zealand, and there's something like 20 or 30 countries that now have some form of the UK Climate Change Act that is part of their governance system, and they're all democracies. Hopefully other dictatorships like Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia will learn from China. One could
We'll
hope.
see. Yeah, I keep an eye on all the like critical mining stuff because it relates to the energy transition. And it was just a few weeks ago. Like it was not on my radar at all, but apparently in Ukraine there where some of the areas where Russia has invaded, there are like lithium deposits that have, we know that they're there, but they haven't been like actualized in any kind of way. And it's like, okay, is Russia getting in the business of clean energy and nobody knew about it? Like what's happening? Maybe we'll be having a different conversation about that in 5 years or 10 years time. But I do want to kind of go back to some of the earlier comments you made about this kind of connection between cost, convenience, and carbon. Is there like a singular solution that you've kind of uncovered, or even a singular story can be one like, that really hones in on this kind of trifecta particularly well?
Yeah, I think it is electrification.
Yeah.
It really is just immensely powerful. And there are things about electricity that we take so for granted, like refrigerators. You don't even think of it as a bad marketing phrase because it's so convenient, it's in your house. But that we should reckon with more. So for example, this is a question for you. Guess when oil became the largest source of energy taking over from coal? It happened in the 20th century. Guess a year. When did it happen?
I believe it was like in the 60s for the US.
You are right, 1965. This is a global number, even it
Oh,
is true
the
for
global
globally.
years.
1965, oil became the largest source of energy. Now, when do you think electricity, doesn't matter where it comes from, but electricity as a form of energy took over oil as a source of energy, just in total amount of energy
I don't believe it's
produced?
happened yet, just because globally
Hmm.
so much of the economy is still quite coal reliant. But with all the technological advancements of like, our
Well,
computers
coal,
don't
it
need.
doesn't, yeah, it doesn't matter where the electricity comes from, but electricity itself as a total amount of energy.
I would say maybe 1985 as a rough guess.
You are right. There you go. So we have been dependent on electricity as our largest form of energy for the last 40 years. And we don't really recognize that. We are completely dependent on fossil fuels, and that's not true. We are dependent really on electricity, and we're going to have to depend more on electricity because it is convenient. Now it is carbon free because we can make it at scale carbon free. And turns out most of that carbon free electricity is pretty cheap. And so you do get the trifecta coming together on electricity.
Well, here's hoping we have a brighter future. I'll ask you my last question, and then we'll go to the audience questions. We have quite a few. Um, climate capitalism is really about climate optimism. There are a lot of great stories that maybe we're not talking about as we, throughout this whole conversation, we've been talking about these solutions. What climate energy nexus challenges do you think we'll be talking about, a decade from now or 20 years from now?
It's a tough one. I would say we'll be talking about how much of our grid is carbon free because that trend is now, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous when I tell people, 50% of all the electricity generated in Germany last year came from renewables. They're like, what? That's true already? Yeah, it's true already. And in 10 years, 2035 is the goal for many countries to have a carbon-free grid. The UK wants to do it by 2030. So we'll be talking about, what a carbon-free grid looks like and what it can enable, not just in carbon reductions, but because we'll have to build and overbuild renewables capacity, what are we going to do with all that cheap, clean energy? Are we going to put it to better uses? Um, on the flip side, I think because of the nature of diplomacy, and because of the North-South divide, and because we know climate impacts are only going to get worse because they will till we stop putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, we're likely to see further polarization between North and South if we don't see enough North to South money transfers. Really, it comes down to that. It's their responsibility to act. Maybe the money transfer doesn't have to happen in actual money. Maybe it happens in technology. Maybe it happens in capacity. Maybe it happens in trade relationships. But some form of recognition that you are responsible for this problem and that you will support other countries on their path to decarbonization. If you don't get that, you see a further polarization between countries. We're already seeing polarization within countries. And who knows, we are seeing a retreat in democracies around the world. And yeah, sadly, there is an acceptance among many that the only way to tackle climate change is to be China, to be dictatorial, to be able to build what we want when we want in the way we want. And there's a really good book by an American university professor called Can Democracy Handle Climate Change? And he makes a passionate case in a 100-page book that democracy is the way to tackle climate change. That as much as you get uh, countries like China, well, a country like China doing something that seems half right on climate, there are no green dictators in the world. Pick up any other dictatorship and you're not going to get that. So hopefully democracies strengthen and don't further weaken. Otherwise, we'll be talking about more problems than climate change, not just climate change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have quite a few audience questions. So we have a question from an anonymous person. They ask, how can governments and industries navigate this transition without increasing inequality, especially in the global south?
Yeah, I think we addressed some of that question, but you're right. I mean, capitalism as a system is driven by accumulating capital in the hands of capital owners, and that means it's inherently set up to create inequality. And the only way we've been able to use what are benefits of a capitalist system, but manage the downsides, and I don't think we've done a great job, but we've done something of a job out of it, is through democracies, is through regulating industries to be doing what society wants and not just some widget that's going to make more profit. And it is a push and pull because if you get too much regulation, then nobody makes any interesting widgets and you don't get innovation. But if you let it be too loose, you get a poor use of what is a really powerful engine. And so one way in which at least developing countries, which are on the path of developing and all of them are using capitalist systems to grow, is to ensure that they learn from the mistakes that have been made in the West and manage capitalism better.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there is no such thing as like a laissez-faire free-hand economy. Like there are
Correct.
regulations all around us. They keep our homes safe and they keep us safe on some level. Follow the rules, so to speak. So yeah, I think I totally agree. have some other questions. Gary Fernall asks, Akshat, what are your views on regarding the transition and CO2 reduction on namer tariffs on Chinese EVs? Is China subsidizing its own market to create wider reliance?
I mean, that is the case with most countries, right? Most countries would prefer, I mean, this is not just companies in a capitalist system. A company would prefer to be a monopoly and thus be able to be the only player providing a solution and thus make the maximum amount of profit because it can charge whatever it wants. And those companies are kept in check by countries. Um, when it's country level trading, where countries want to be the only suppliers of a particular solution, it is geopolitics that comes into play to keep that in check. And that's what you're seeing, right? If China's motives are to be the only supplier of all things clean energy, well, tariffs are this reaction that the Western countries have to that problem because there are certain industries, maybe solar is not one of them, but other industries which are just crucial from a national security perspective. You want to be able to make steel in your country if you ever have to go to war. Your weapons and your defense systems are going to require steel, and you better have a system to make steel. And so, there are other reasons beyond economic reasons for wanting to tackle what might look like a Chinese way of monopolizing the supply chain for all sorts of clean energy. Um, it does mean it's going to be a less, more expensive energy transition, but what you want is an energy transition that is sustained, not that is just cheap. You want it to be sustained and maybe slightly expensive. That's okay.
Yeah, totally. Something we didn't touch on, but is important because it relates to that equity question, is human displacement. It's, a lot of folks are internally displaced or internationally displaced. Fahim Hussein asks, human displacement is an issue rising globally. And these refugees need access to energy. Can green economy be profitable in dealing with refugees? Like, are there some kind of highlights from your book that could be employed to help deal with this kind of emerging and growing issue?
Not in my book, no. I mean, the point of the book was to try and unpack solutions that are working at scale and what made them work at scale. But by that filter, it meant that solutions that aren't working at scale aren't in the book. So no, you don't have lab-grown meat in there, or you don't have how we're dealing with displacement. Those are really important problems that we do need solutions for. And those are problems that are only going to get worse, right? We are seeing what kinds of secondary impact that can have on politics in countries. It's no longer in one or two economies. This is happening across the world where displacement is causing problems, not just in rich countries, but also in developing countries. India, look at India and all its neighbors. It has a beef with all of them. Some of it, or most of it, has to do with some form of displacement of people. So yes, it's not a problem that we've been able to find good solutions for. Largely, there will be political solutions. I don't know of enough technology solutions to be able to solve what is a very human problem.
Yeah. I mean, maybe in the future will be kind of pop-up grids that aid agencies can just, put a microgrid right there to help help.
Those are already there and they are growing. I mean, that is true. Yeah, but again, those are band-aids. They're not addressing the main problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Our last audience question, Kaushik Deb asks, one place where capitalism and markets can help with getting to net zero is carbon markets. Any thoughts?
Well, carbon markets don't feature in my book as a climate solution, and I'm being specific about it. Regulated carbon markets do, because regulated carbon markets do work. Voluntary carbon markets don't, because voluntary carbon markets don't work. And we have seen over the past few years, and we've done a lot of work at Bloomberg Green, where I work, around voluntary carbon markets and how they're just open to abuse and gaming the system because there are no punishments. There is no government that's going to put some criminals behind bars for having made up numbers, having created fraud. And that's the reason why carbon markets haven't worked so far, which is not to say they cannot work, but we have regulated carbon markets that do work. And it is a possible solution for money transfers from rich countries to developing countries because they can allow for large sums to go across borders, but it will only happen if there is trust in the system. And currently, that trust is not there because the veracity of these carbon reductions aren't robust. And that is a very big hill to climb. So if you are thinking about climate solutions, there are several ones that you can be working on that are working at scale that can take your brain power and will benefit from it than voluntary carbon markets. I say it's $1 billion market right now that sucks up $100 billion worth of intellectual capacity, and it's not worth it.
Yeah. No, totally. This has been such an enriching conversation. We touched on so many different topics from like democracy and retreat and how, capitalism is a way to help fuel the energy transformation that we need to see to address our climate challenges. We've talked about things like the election and the upcoming conferences of the parties. We even touched on some of the big kind of solutions and transformations that have been happening on a corporate level as well as a policy level. Just want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me and open the door if there's anything that you want to say that maybe like you can get a chance to talk about during our conversation, if there's something that you want to close with.
Well, that was a lovely, wide-ranging conversation. Thank you for the questions. Thank you also to the audience for those questions. Yeah, I mean, I think there are many, many challenges that need to be overcome in tackling climate change. And the nice thing, if there is one good thing about climate change, is that we have places where many of the solutions are being deployed at scale. And there's much we can learn and apply to our own regions, places, cities, companies, and all of us have agency, regardless of which role you find yourself in, and whether you're able to work on it full time or you're able to give it an hour a week. Everybody can contribute, and that's not a bad place to be. Given we didn't choose to be here, but we are here now. So at least we have agency to try and tackle the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great if we were at the same spot, maybe in 2020 or the year 2000.
Or 1990, for
Yeah, that
sure.
would be great.
Yes. Yeah, there was 1989 is when the UNFCCC, well, when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put out its first report. So that, we've known about the problem for a while.
Yeah, but at least we're here finally. And maybe, just maybe, we can scale up these solutions and create a better path forward. I just want to remind everybody that they can buy this lovely book wherever new books are sold. You can also go to Akshat Rathi's website, which is akshatrathi.com. You can go /book and find his book. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. It was a delight, and thank you to the audience for your questions.